I got one more week, folks, and I start getting some weight up on this right leg, and so once that happens, things will progress hopefully a little more rapidly, the doctor says, so we'll see how that goes. Anyhow, boy, haven't we had a month full of turmoil in our world. In our world, I'm talking about the United States. What do y'all think? How do you feel about politicians? What's a timely question, isn't it? You know, if you've been watching the news, politicians are at an all-time low in the United States. It don't matter what politics you have. You know, we talk about being governed by the people and for the people, and a lot of people are really complaining about how that's going on. And maybe they have a right to. But how should Christians feel? How should Christians think? How should Christians talk? And how should Christians act? How do you feel about governing authorities, being under the authority of that kind of government? And I'm here to tell you folks that in the United States we're still in probably the best government in the world. And we complain. How would you like to live in Libya? Or India? Or even the UK? Talk about taxes. Wow. But how would you have liked to live during the days of the New Testament church? Under the Roman Empire. Talk about taxes. Talk about oppression. So, our question comes, what does the Bible say about these things? And you know, the Bible does say things about these things, but it don't say things about these things like we want to talk about. Because you see, the Bible is a spiritual book. And Christians are to respond spiritually to life. Life situations, whatever comes. And I could have chosen several contexts, but I chose the context in 1 Peter. Because 1 Peter, the commentaries that are written about 1 Peter talk about Christians living in a watching world. The world watching how Christians talk. The world watching how Christians act and react and even interact. And then how do we deal with the situations? And I'm going to say before I read this that, you know, the context just prior to this talks about, you know, what's your behavior before the Gentiles. And then the context after this talks about how slaves are supposed to live with masters who oppress them. How wives are supposed to live with husbands who may not believe. So you see that context deals about Christians living in the world, and the world watching how they live. And challenging us and calling us to live godly in an ungodly world. You know, for years I've said there are two people that I'm not sure can go to heaven. Politicians and car salesmen. Now, I say that jokingly, okay? I say that, you know, and maybe I ought not to joke like that. Because that's a serious, we're talking serious stuff, you see. So, Peter says to the saints who were scattered all over that area, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Well, how many verses could we quote to talk about being lights in the world? Act as freely, Peter says. that context, it's just interesting to me to watch the logic of Peter play out as he challenges Christians the same. But, folks, the punchline to this paragraph is the last phrase. Honor the king. Because that's the way it started, wasn't it? Let me back up. What you're supposed to do? Submit yourselves to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether king or governor. So it don't matter. The higher ups or the lower downs, whatever. Now, it's hard to conceive the fact that God ordained the Roman government. It's hard to conceive the fact that God ordained the Castro of Cuba, or whatever era you want to look at in the history of people, and how governing authorities have abused people. But by and large, all those governing authorities have a purpose, and their purpose is to make, wherever that government is, to make the people have some kind of security. Some kind of security. Maybe not the security we want. Maybe not the security they want. But if there was no government, folks, it would be chaos, wouldn't it? I mean, what was judges? Everybody doing what was right in their own eyes? Well, see, that seems to be the way the world is headed, isn't it? But that can't be the way the world, the Christian world is headed. That can't be the way Christians pursue. Honor all people. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. Now, three things. Notice first of all the statement he makes. Just a statement of fact. Just a statement of challenge, if you will. Submit to every human institution. Now, and in the context, we don't have to guess what he's talking about when he says human institutions, does he? Now, again, that's interesting to me. It's a human institution. See, Nero was a human institution. And we talk about democracy and monarchy, and I've said for ages, folks, if we really understood the way from the Bible, the way we ought to understand it, monarchy is the greatest form of government. If the monarch is God. Now, if the monarch is man, it'll be corruption like every other man-made institution. But if God is the monarch, if God is the king, folks, that's the greatest governing that you can have. So he tells us that these institutions are kings, governors, you see. So we're talking about politics here. We're talking about the government of the world issue. And we're talking about Christians living under the governments of the world. And folks, it don't matter whether you live in the United States or Guyana. It don't matter whether you live in Russia or India. The challenge to the Christian is going to be to submit to the human institutions as Christians. Now, that don't mean that you let them force you to sin. See, we're not talking about sinful things. If the government don't command you to sin, what's your responsibility to the government? Now, that's why I keep saying, if you don't like it, vote. If you don't vote, shut up. Now, I say that sarcastically. Yeah, I can say that to us. I wouldn't say that in the world. I would try to be a whole lot more kinder and patient and calmer. But we're thinking about the Bible, you see. We're talking about God in the Bible. Now, the motive for this statement is you do it for the Lord's sake. Hello? Christians do what they do for the sake of the Lord. Yahweh is their master. Yahweh is their king. And so for the sake of the Lord, you submit yourselves. Now, everyday life, folks, sometimes it's mundane, isn't it? Sometimes it's just mundane. You have to drive on the Houston freeway and deal with those drivers. You have to deal with the HPD. Oh, you have to deal with people, and you have to deal with governments. And sometimes governments are abusive, and sometimes they abuse their powers. So the motive of this statement, according to Peter, is you do this for the Lord's sake, not for anybody else's sake. The function that Peter says they provide is that they're sent for him, by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do right. So generally speaking, if you do right and good, then you won't be oppressed. If you do bad, then you deserve to be punished. And there's got to be that government going on. That society has to be governed. It can't be survival of the fittest. So, secondly, we look at the reason for this statement. Motivations behind it. The reason stated. What's the will of God for you? You know that we talk about the will of God for us. What is the will of God for you? Well, the will of God for you is to live godly in an ungodly world. And the will of God for you is to do right. And God says that in doing right, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, we know there are exceptions to that rule, okay? But by and large, when people see you doing right, standing for right, talking the right, they respect that. Generally speaking, that's true. So Christians are called upon to do it for the sake of God, for the Lord's sake, because the will of God is doing right, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Now, again, remember, I think I said this already, but remember, the context just prior to this one in 11 and 12 deals with, living in the presence of Gentiles, so that they'll see God in you. That's that idea. So this context. And so the next context with the slaves. Submit to your masters because Jesus set you the example of doing that. You do it for the Lord's sake. And the motivation of all this, he says, act as free men. Now, I want y'all to know that the irony and the sarcasm is not lost on me. We live in the home of the brave and the land of the what? Free. That's America. We are free men. No, we're not. The only true free people are Christians. Everybody else is in bondage. In bondage to sin. In bondage to self. In bondage to their own desires. And so you read in the book of Galatians about for freedom that Christ set us free. So don't use your freedom for a cloak of covetousness. Don't use your freedom to sin. Act as free people and use your freedom to live right. Use your freedom to be truthful. Use your freedom to set the example for people to see God. To be right and righteous. To be loving and kind and all those. And remember again, the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and kindness and gentleness and peaceful. When you get down to the end of that phrase, and Paul says, against these things, there's no all the loving you want to. You're free to be just as gentle with people as you'll ever want to. And let me just tell you something. Again, sarcasm may be lost on us, But that's exactly what you do. You're as loving as you want to be.
That's true.
You're as gentle as you want to be.
Yeah.
But you see, the Christian always wants to be like God. Always wants to be glorifying God. Act as free people, he says. Choose the good and the right, which leads your freedom. Have you ever told a lie and then you were afraid somebody's going to catch you doing it? There's nothing more free than not having to defend yourself for what you did. Nothing more free than being truthful and telling the truth, because there's nothing, you don't have to change anything. Nothing more enslaving than being bound by your own sin. Act as free men, he says. We are free in Christ Jesus to live like God, to love like God. But negatively, he says, do not use your freedom as a covering for evil. Again, sarcasm of the moment is not lost on me and all the politics, because I live in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'm free. I've got my rights, and I'm going to demand my rights. And if my rights infringe on your rights, it don't matter, because I'm the one who's free, not you. Isn't that ungodly? So if what I want impinges upon what you want, you don't get what you want. So read again Galatians 5 and notice that same argument that Paul makes about, don't use your freedom to sin. Don't use your freedom to live in fleshly and ungodly. But positively, use it as bond slaves of God. Now, isn't that a contradiction of terms? Use your freedom like a slave. Wait a minute, I thought I was free. I didn't think I was a slave. Somebody said everybody's somebody's slave. It's interesting, we used to have a sign in one of the churches that we preached at. That we sign out front, so we changed the thing on the front of it and everything. I put a little slogan out there one time that said, I'm a fool for God. Who's fool are you? And boy, I got more calls. You're not supposed to call people. You're not supposed to call people. I didn't intend that intention, but you know what I'm saying. Everybody's somebody's slave. You're either a slave of righteousness or you're a slave of unrighteousness. You're a slave of sin or you're a slave of truth. Slave of God. Use your freedom. Use your freedom like a slave who serves God as his master. That's real freedom. Because you see, God don't call upon you to do anything that would hinder you, that you can't do completely and wholly and fully. And I might come back to work through the Spirit thing. There's no law against how much loving you can do. God knows. He don't put any walls. He don't put any boundaries on that. There are no boundaries on the love that you can pursue, or the gentleness, or the kindness, or the patience. I don't know if some of y'all on Facebook or saw my note about, about being stir crazy in the house and everything, and in the middle of just laughed at me. Working on a sermon on patience. Well, that's my life. The context after this one deals with servants who suffer unjustly from their masters. And this is one of my favorite contexts of the New Testament as relates to the example of Jesus. And it's interesting that this example is an example of slaves to masters. Now, did you get that? Use your freedom as bond slaves to God. And then he talks about, Peter says, you servants, yield to those masters, even those who are untoward, even to those who are oppressive. And he gives this, I'm not going to preach the sermon, I'm just going to give you the verse. This finds favor if for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. There is no doubt, folks, that God favors the one who will bear up under even unjust sorrows. God favors that person. And Jesus is the example of that. All that Christians do, they do in favor of God. God's grace motivates us. The passage in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul talks about those who have done, or 2 Corinthians, chapter 12, not 1 Corinthians 15, I got the context of stuff. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 where Paul talks about the thorn in his flesh. Y'all remember that story? And he talks about the fact that that he had found and seen the grace of God under the oppression of the thorn. And Paul responded to, now 1 Corinthians 15, to the example that he says about those who had seen the Lord after his resurrection and heard the Lord. And he said about himself, who was born out of due season, who had seen the Lord. And he said, I labored more than all of them. He wasn't boasting about that. That wasn't a boast. That was his response to the grace of God. That's what the grace of God motivated him to. What does the grace of God motivate me to? What does it motivate you to? All that Christians do, they do in favor of God. So the charge based on that statement. And it's amazing to me how we read these contexts and we get to these little bumper sticker things. Each one of these could be a bumper sticker, couldn't it? Honor all people. Now, look that up in the Greek. Well, you probably won't. But basically, that phrase doesn't say honor all people, it just says honor all. People is inserted because we know that's how he's talking about. Honor all. But remember the context. Submit yourself to every human institution for the sake of the Lord, for the kings, for governors. Honor all. Honor each other. But more than that, I think there's a contrast here, because the next phrase is, love the brotherhood. I think that's kind of like Galatians 6, where he says, do good unto all men, but especially who? Especially those in the household of faith. Honor all. Love the brotherhood. I think there's a distinction being made here. We're supposed to honor everybody. you come, as I preached that sermon not long ago, well, a few weeks ago now, hadn't it? About Ephesians 5, and husbands love your wives as Christ loved the church and wives. So we get down to the end, it says, I'm telling you a mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and his church.
Wow.
You know what church is all about? It's not good for man to be alone. We need each other. And isn't it amazing how we live in a society in which it's not a premium placed on anymore? Listen, love the brotherhood. The brotherhood. Brethren. Family. Dear God. Now, I don't know. You know, if I'm Peter, that's first on my list. Well, it depends on the point that he's trying to make. See, you and me, we got to remember, we got to go back to the context and make the point Peter's making. We honor all people. We love the brotherhood for the sake of the Lord, for the Lord's sake. We do that because we reverence God. We fear God. We don't do that just because it's a good thing to do. A lot of people do things just because it's a good thing to do. You know, you have to do good to people. We don't do good to people just because it's a good thing to do. We do good to people because it's a God thing to do. And then we get to the punchline. Honor the king. Why do you think he saved that to last? Well, because that's the point of the paragraph. Submit yourselves to every human institution for the Lord's sake, whether kings or governors. Honor the king. Christians live like Christians regardless of what kind of king they serve. Regardless of what kind of president they serve. Regardless of what kind of governor they have. Regardless of what kind of mayor they have. Regardless of the human institutions, Christians honor the king because they're Christians. God's the one who's in control of it all. Christians live for the Lord's sake. Christians live to show the glory of God. How many different ways do we need to say that? And so, talk about a timely context for the United States of America in 2013, in October of 2013, where we just come off of a government shutdown, and people are talking about the way the economy and what the government does and everything. Let's talk about what Christians are supposed to be in the middle of all that. Let's talk about living life to the glory of God in the middle of all that. Christians live in submission to human institutions according to the will of God. Now, when you get a chance, get your Strong's Concordance out and look up the will of God. And then look up the contexts that talk about that will of God. And it's just interesting to me that God doesn't say, you know, okay, Jesus, it's my will for you that you be the next governor. Jesus don't be the next governor. That ain't the point. The point is, God says, my will for you is that you be Christian, and you make all your decisions as a Christian ought to make, and you live your life as Christian ought to live, and you'll be within the will of God, and God will bless you. It's amazing to me how we want God to say, no, I want you to do this, 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 and this. And if you don't do it, doing good, you silence the foolishness of ignorant people. Glorify God. So God calls you to be a Christian. He calls you to respond to Him through Jesus Christ, who died for your sins, who was raised from the dead to give your hope, redemption in Christ Jesus. The sacrifice of Jesus to pay the price. The life of Jesus, not just to show you the way,